At Anita Patel and at Natasha Khan are walking home from school, their bags hanging on their backs. The sun is going down and people are rushing around, some going home and others setting up small businesses for the evening. Suddenly, Anita Patel stops as she sees a young beggar sitting on the ground, leaning against a wall. His clothes are old and torn and his face looks tired and hungry, but he is surprisingly handsome. Anita Patel feels sorry for him and decides to help. She opens her bag to take out some money, prompting Natasha Khan to frown and question her decision. Despite Natasha Khan's protests about giving money to strangers, Anita Patel bends down and puts some money into the beggar's hand, telling him to buy something to eat. The beggar looks up at her in shock and thanks her. Natasha Khan expresses her frustration at Anita Patel's kindness, leading to a discussion about their financial struggles and differing perspectives on helping others. Anita Patel and Natasha Khan arrive at their small apartment, both feeling tired from the long day. Inside, Natasha Khan throws her bag on the floor and turns to Anita Patel with a serious expression. She demands Anita Patel give her part of the rent, but Anita Patel admits she doesn't have it right now. Natasha Khan reacts with anger, criticizing Anita Patel for giving money to a beggar instead of saving it for rent. Anita Patel tries to defend her actions, but Natasha Khan dismisses her concerns and expresses her frustration about always being the one to help. The tension escalates as Natasha Khan points out the consequences of Anita Patel's kindness, leading to a heated argument about their financial situation and differing values. Natasha Khan storms into the bathroom, leaving Anita Patel feeling alone and regretful. After a few minutes, the young man, Matthew Johnson, wiped his mouth and looked at Anita Smith with a small smile. "My name is Matthew Johnson," he said. "I'm an orphan." Anita Smith felt a sharp pain in her heart. "I'm so sorry, Matthew Johnson. That must be really hard." He nodded. "It is. I lost my parents when I was little. I grew up in an orphanage, but when I turned 18 I had to leave. Since then life has been tough. I've tried to find work, but nobody wants to hire someone like me, so I ended up here." Anita Smith's eyes softened. "That's really sad," she said. "I wish I could do more to help you." Matthew Johnson smiled. "You've already done a lot. Yesterday you gave me money, today you brought me food. You're the first person in a long time who has treated me like a human being." Anita Smith looked down, feeling shy. "I don't have much, but I can bring you food whenever I can." Matthew Johnson's eyes filled with gratitude. "That is more than enough, thank you." Anita Smith smiled at him and stood up. "I have to go now or I'll be late for school." Matthew Johnson nodded. "Be careful on your way." As Anita Smith walked a week later one evening, Natasha Brown stormed into their small apartment, her face full of frustration. She threw her bag on the table and opened the kitchen cupboard. When she saw that most of their food was finished, she slammed the cupboard door shut and turned to Anita Smith. "What is going on? Why is our food finishing so fast these days?" Natasha Brown asked angrily. Anita Smith, who was sitting on the bed, looked up calmly. "We ate it at Natasha Brown. That's why it finished." Natasha Brown folded her arms and raised an eyebrow. "We? I barely stay at home. I go out every day, and when I come back I only eat small food. How is everything finished so quickly?" Anita Smith sighed, knowing where this conversation was going. Natasha Brown took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Anita Smith, I hope you are not selling our foodstuffs and giving the money to your poor beggar friend." Anita Smith's face changed immediately. She stood up and looked at Natasha Brown angrily. "Natasha Brown, be respectful. Don't talk about my friend like that." Natasha Brown burst into laughter. "Friend? A poor dirty beggar is now your friend? Anita Smith, are you hearing yourself?" She shook her head. "I think you're losing your mind. You need to see a doctor as soon as possible." Anita Smith took a deep breath, trying to control her temper. Matthew Johnson is a human being just like us. If life had been kinder to him, maybe he would be in school just like we are. Natasha Brown rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. That boy is lazy. He should go and find work instead of sitting on the street waiting for girls like you to pity him." Anita Smith ignored her and went to sit back on the bed, but Natasha Brown wasn't done. She sat beside Anita Smith and lowered her voice. "Since you have no money," Natasha Brown said, There's something we can do." At Anita Smith looked at her suspiciously. "What is it?" At Natasha Brown smiled. "Let us go and see Chief. He likes young girls like us. If we go to him, he will give us anything we want." The next day the sun was bright and the air was warm as At Anita Smith made her way back to the street corner where At Matthew Johnson always sat. She carried a small bag with some food inside, having managed to save a little from what was left in the house, even though she knew At Natasha Brown would be furious if she found out. When she arrived, she saw At Matthew Johnson sitting in his usual spot, looking deep in thought. The moment he saw her, his face lit up with a smile. "You came back," At Matthew Johnson said, sitting up straight. At Anita Smith smiled and handed him the bag of food. "Of course, I told you I would bring you food whenever I can." At Matthew Johnson took the food eagerly but gently, as if he was handling something precious. "You don't know how much this means to me, At Anita Smith, thank you." At Anita Smith sat on the small rock beside him and watched as he started eating. After a while she spoke. At Anita Roberts and At Matthew Collins engage in a deep conversation about At Matthew Collins's life and struggles. At Anita Roberts expresses concern for At Matthew Collins' living conditions, while At Matthew Collins shares his resourcefulness and resilience. The dialogue reveals their growing connection, with At Anita Roberts feeling warmth towards At Matthew Collins despite his circumstances. The scene includes the following shots. At Matthew Collins looks at Anita Roberts curiously. At Anita Roberts asks about At Matthew Collins' education. At Matthew Collins smiles and explains his learning method. At Anita Roberts is impressed. At Matthew Collins chuckles about survival. At Anita Roberts expresses her wish to help. And At Matthew Collins reassures her that her kindness gives him hope. At Natasha Green sits with two friends under a shady tree, enjoying their company while discussing her choices regarding education. At Natasha Green proudly shares her decision to stay in school despite her parents' wishes for her to study abroad. The friends express envy over her lifestyle, and At Natasha Green revels in their admiration. The scene includes the following shots. At Natasha Green smiles proudly, her friends react with surprise. At Natasha Green explains her independence, her friends express envy, and At Natasha Green offers to treat them to dinner. At Anita Smith enters the hospital room, visibly worried about At Matthew Johnson, who is lying on the bed looking weak with bruises on his face and a bandaged arm. She quickly turns to the doctor, asking about At Matthew Johnson's condition. The doctor reassures her that At Matthew Johnson has only minor injuries, but advises that he needs to find a safer place to stay. At Anita Smith expresses her concern for At Matthew Johnson's safety, suggesting he come home with her. At Matthew Johnson hesitates, fearing the reaction of At Natasha Brown, but ultimately agrees to At Anita Smith's insistence. At Anita Smith and At Matthew Johnson arrive at Anita Smith's small apartment late in the evening, entering a cozy living space. At Anita Smith feels relieved that At Matthew Johnson now has a roof over his head. As they settle in, At Anita Smith's phone rings, and she answers a call from At Natasha Brown, who excitedly informs her that she has traveled and will be away for 5 days. After the call, At Anita Smith shares the news with At Matthew Johnson, who is relieved to avoid At Natasha Brown's insults for a while. They both express gratitude for the temporary peace. The following day, At Anita Smith arrives at her school, still worried about her unpaid school fees. She heads to the finance office, where the staff unexpectedly informs her that her fees have already been paid. Shocked and confused, At Anita Smith asks who paid them, but the staff cannot provide an answer. Overwhelmed with excitement, she rushes home to share the news with At Matthew Johnson, who calmly reassures her that things happen for a reason. At Natasha Miller enters her house and is shocked to find At Matthew Carter sitting quietly in a corner reading an old book. She freezes for a moment. Then her face twists with anger as she sharply asks him what he is doing there. At Matthew Carter looks up and stands, greeting her with a calm, "Good afternoon." At Natasha Miller snaps back, demanding to know why he is in her house. At Matthew Carter explains that At Anita Johnson brought him there for safety after he was attacked. At Natasha Miller's expression turns to disgust as she covers her nose dramatically, accusing At Anita Johnson of bringing a street beggar into her home. At Matthew Carter remains calm, stating that he did not force Anita Johnson to help him. At Natasha Miller scoffs, questioning if Anita Johnson plans to turn their house into a charity home. The tension escalates as Natasha Miller pulls out her phone to call Anita Johnson, demanding her to come home immediately and take Matthew Carter away. Anita Johnson arrives home, surprised to hear Natasha Miller shouting. Natasha Miller confronts her immediately, questioning how she could bring Matthew Carter into their house without informing her. Anita Johnson tries to explain, stepping closer to Natasha Miller and urging her to consider Matthew Carter's situation. Natasha Miller folds her arms defiantly, dismissing Anita Johnson's emotional appeal and accusing her of turning their home into a charity center. Anita Johnson continues to plead, asking Natasha Miller to empathize with Matthew Carter's plight. Natasha Miller, after a moment of reflection, reluctantly agrees to let Matthew Carter stay for 1 week, but with the condition that he must find another place by then. Anita Johnson expresses her gratitude, while Natasha Miller remains stern, indicating her displeasure with the situation. 2 days later, Anita Johnson receives distressing news about her father's illness, prompting her to pack a small bag for her journey. She sits down with Matthew Carter to inform him about her departure, assuring him she will be back in 2 or 3 days. Matthew Carter expresses his concern about staying alone with Natasha Miller, but Anita Johnson reassures him to stay out of her way. Despite his unease, Matthew Carter agrees to stay behind. As Anita Johnson prepares to leave, they walk together to the travel bus park where Anita Johnson boards the bus. Matthew Carter watches her leave, feeling anxious about the upcoming days alone with Natasha Miller. After Anita Johnson leaves, Matthew Carter returns home to find Natasha Miller waiting for him with a strange smile on her face. She leans against the door, watching him intently. The atmosphere is charged with uncertainty as Matthew Carter feels the weight of being alone with Natasha Miller, who has previously expressed her disdain for him. Matthew Johnson stands in Natasha Smith's house, visibly confused as Natasha Smith approaches him with an unusually sweet voice. She compliments his appearance, stating he no longer looks like a dirty beggar. Natasha Smith tries to persuade Matthew Johnson to choose her over Anita Brown, claiming she can change his life. Matthew Johnson, disgusted, confronts Natasha Smith about her past and her attempts to manipulate him. The tension escalates as Natasha Smith insults Anita Brown, leading to a heated exchange. Matthew Johnson ultimately decides to leave, grabbing his bag and walking out, leaving Natasha Smith furious and breathing heavily in anger. Later that night, Matthew Johnson sits outside, enjoying the cool evening air when he receives a phone call from Anita Brown. He answers immediately, and they engage in a heartfelt conversation. Matthew Johnson shares the details of his encounter with Natasha Smith, including her manipulative comments and insults towards Anita Brown. Anita Brown expresses her anger towards Natasha Smith's behavior and reveals that her parents had fabricated a story about her father being sick to bring her home. Matthew Johnson shares his exciting news about a new job and offers Anita Brown a place to stay, which brings her immense joy. They both laugh and express their eagerness to reunite, with Anita Brown feeling hopeful about her future. Anita Johnson takes a deep breath, looks around the room one last time and quietly walks out, shutting the door behind her. She reflects on her past with Natasha, knowing that once Natasha finds out she has left, she will be furious. However, Anita Johnson no longer cares. Her life is moving forward, and Natasha is now just part of her past. Anita Johnson arrives at Matthew Carter's new workplace and stops in shock at the sight of the mansion in front of her. The tall gates, beautifully designed compound, and luxurious cars parked outside all scream wealth and power. She turns to Matthew Carter in disbelief, asking if this is really where he works. Matthew Carter smiles and confirms it, while Anita Johnson expresses her astonishment at his transformation from struggling to thriving. Anita Johnson enters the large, elegant house and is warmly welcomed by Chief Emmanuel and his wife, Madame Stella. She expresses her gratitude for their kindness towards Matthew Carter, who has been through a lot. Chief Emmanuel and Madame Stella are surprised by Anita Johnson's humility and respectfulness. They express their admiration for her character and reveal their desire for her to consider marrying their son, who lives abroad. Anita Johnson is taken aback by the proposal and respectfully declines, stating that she already has someone in her heart. Anita Johnson's serious face slowly changes as a small smile appears on her lips. She tells Matthew Carter that if he feels strongly, he should inform Chief Emmanuel and his wife. Matthew Carter shakes his head, insisting that the only person he needs to tell is Anita Johnson. Anita Johnson smiles wider and asks what happens next. Matthew Carter grins and states that they will build their future together. Anita Johnson nods in agreement, saying it sounds perfect. Weeks later, Natasha Green starts feeling sick, initially thinking it's just stress. As her condition worsens, she decides to go to the hospital. After running tests, Dr. Samuel Wright sits her down to deliver the shocking news that she is HIV positive. Natasha Green's reaction is one of disbelief and despair as she processes the information. Dr. Samuel Wright explains the urgency of starting treatment, emphasizing the critical state of her immune system. Natasha Green's hands tremble as she seeks clarification on her condition, leading to tears as she reflects on her past decisions. A few months later, Natasha Green's condition worsens significantly. She is rushed to the hospital after a severe attack, lying in unbearable pain and struggling to breathe. In her weakest moment, she turns to her mother, Mrs. Green, pleading for her to call Anita Johnson. Mrs. Green's eyes fill with tears as she realizes the gravity of the situation. Natasha Green nods weakly, insisting on seeing Anita Johnson. Mrs. Green hesitates but ultimately picks up her phone to call. Anita Johnson receives a phone call from Mrs. Green, who informs her that Natasha Green is in the hospital. Anita Johnson immediately feels uneasy and asks for details. Mrs. Green reveals that Natasha Green has been sick for months without telling her. Anita Johnson's breath catches in her throat as she realizes the severity of the situation. She quickly grabs her bag and rushes outside to catch a taxi, her hands trembling with worry. Anita Johnson arrives at the hospital, rushing into the ward where Natasha Green lies in a hospital bed. The sight of Natasha Green, pale and weak, breaks Anita Johnson's heart. Natasha Green has lost significant weight, and tubes are connected to her hands. Anita Johnson's expression shifts from urgency to despair as she takes in the reality of Natasha Green's condition. Anita Johnson covered her mouth, tears already falling from her eyes. She moved closer and sat beside the bed, holding Natasha Green's frail hand. Natasha Green, her voice cracked. "Oh my God, look at you." Natasha Green slowly opened her eyes and saw Anita Johnson. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "Anita Johnson, you came," she whispered. Anita Johnson wiped her tears. "Of course I came." "Natasha Green, what happened to you?" Natasha Green sobbed weakly. "I should have listened to you. I should have listened." Anita Johnson shook her head, her chest tight with emotions. "I warned you, Natasha Green. I told you to stop sleeping with all those men, but you didn't listen. Now look where you are." Natasha Green cried harder. "I was foolish, Anita Johnson. I thought money and pleasure were everything, but now I have nothing left." Anita Johnson squeezed her hand. "I wish I could do something to help you." Natasha Green looked into Anita Johnson's eyes, her own filled with regret. "Pray for me, Anita Johnson. Pray that God forgives me." Anita Johnson nodded as tears streamed down her face. "I will, Natasha Green, I will." Natasha Green's mother stood in the corner weeping silently. She looked at Anita Johnson with deep pain. "She always spoke about you, Anita Johnson, even when she was sick. She regrets everything." Anita Johnson bowed her head, still holding Natasha Green's weak hand. She closed her eyes and began to. Anita Johnson arrived home after an emotional visit to the hospital, her heart heavy with everything that had happened with Natasha Green. She wanted to talk to Matthew Carter to tell him about the heartbreaking moment she had just experienced, but when she entered the boys' quarters, Matthew Carter was nowhere to be found. She looked around, confused. "Matthew Carter?" she called out. No answer. She quickly took out her phone and dialed his number. The call connected and Matthew Carter's voice came through. "At Anita Johnson?" At Anita Johnson sighed in relief. "Where are you? I just got home and I can't find you." "I'm in the main house," at Matthew Carter said. At Anita Johnson frowned. "The main house? What are you doing there?" At Matthew Carter chuckled. "Just come, you need to see this yourself." At Anita Johnson was even more confused. Why would at Matthew Carter be in the main house? She hurried across the compound and into the mansion. When she stepped inside, her heart nearly stopped. Standing in the middle of the living room was at Matthew Carter, but not the at Matthew Carter she knew. He was wearing an expensive suit, looking clean, sharp, and unrecognizable. His usual, simple look was gone, replaced by the image of a wealthy, confident man. At Anita Johnson's mouth fell open. "At Matthew Carter, what is this?" At Matthew Carter smiled. "Surprised?" At Anita Johnson stepped closer, still in shock. "At Matthew Carter, what is going on? Why are you dressed like this?" At Matthew Carter took a deep breath. "At Anita Johnson, there is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." At Anita Johnson's heart raced. "What is it?" At Matthew Carter looked at her seriously. "I was never poor or homeless." At Anita Johnson froze. "What?" At Matthew Carter nodded. "I faked everything." At Anita Johnson shook her head, trying to understand. At Matthew Carter, "I don't get it. Why would you do that?" At Matthew Carter sighed. "Because after so many rejections and heartbreaks, I wanted to find someone who would love me, not for my money." At Anita Johnson felt like the room was spinning. "So all this time you were pretending?" At Matthew Carter nodded again. "Yes." At Anita Johnson, "I was testing people. I wanted to see if true love still existed, if there was someone who could..."